Something most folks don't like to think about, but something that's very important to our city is the cemeteries. And so today we're going to look a little bit at the history of the cemeteries in our city. Before 1842, there was no recognized cemetery for the small community at the mouth of Black River called Port Huron. The city of Port Huron wouldn't be incorporated until 1857. Before that, there was a hodgepodge. You had plats, you had townships, you had villages, and you had Fort Gratiot. The first cemetery we want to look at was located in the Thorn Plat. Today, the Thorn Plat would be in this area right here. In 1924, there was an article written about a lady and her recollections of a cemetery that was on Fort Street. It says this: early resident recalls burial 75 years ago. This would have been back in the 1800s. Long-buried human bones found in digging a sewer on Fort Street recently awakened memories for Mrs. Mary Wolfe. Mrs. Wolfe was born on Fort Street, and she remembers a small, semi-private cemetery located there during her youth. It was the early days of the town, said Mrs. Wolfe, when practically all the inhabitants lived in what is now the First Ward. Major Thorne laid out the Thorn Plot, and while there was no regular cemetery, a certain bit of ground was known as the burying ground. I believe Major Thorne was buried there, as well as his father, Captain William Thorne. At that time I was too young to attend the funeral, but I knew of the burials being made there. This map from the 1800s. You can see Fort Street was pretty well covered with residences up until you got to Bard Street. And you can see an empty piece of land between Bard and Beers. Then going west to east, it would have been between Fort Street and Huron Street. Of course, Huron Street is no longer there today. But this is about where it would be, where that red line is, and that green rectangle where the cemetery might be, where the Chase Bank property is. But that's just an educated guess. In the article, it says, at a later date, a cemetery was established east of Military Street and south of Griswold. And that's the one we want to look at next. In the 1830s, Port Huron was chopped up pretty well into plats and villages and then townships. And the part we want to look at right now, back then in the 1830s, the part between the two red lines would have been the township of Desmond. And then below the red line would have been the village of Peru. But in the 1840s, that area became the Port Huron Township. Certainly not where the township is today. I said all that so that when I show you the first sentence of this article here, you'll understand what I'm talking about when I say Port Huron Township. Township buys 1.5 acres. September 21, 1842, the Board of Health of the Township of Port Huron bought 1.5 acres in Section 15 from Henry Robertson for $300. This property, north of Minnie Street, was bounded on the east by the center of Gratiot Turnpike, several rods east of the present Military Street. And that property was to be used for a cemetery. Looking down from the satellite map, this area would be just south of Desmond Landing. The article said just north of Minnie Street. Well, the blue line here represents Minnie Street. Military Street would be that gray line going horizontally across just below the text of Minnie Street. But then the Gratiot Turnpike, that was east of Military Street, closer to the water. And that's represented by the yellow line. So the cemetery would have been in the area north of Minnie Street, but the eastern boundary was the center of Gratiot Turnpike. And that's represented by the red rectangle. We don't know how wide it was, and we don't know for sure how close it was to Minnie Street, but it was in that area. We do know it was 1.5 acres, however. April 8, 1848, Daniel B. Harrington, on behalf of the citizens of the little community, wrote to Kingsley Bingham, member of Congress from Michigan, and asked him to obtain the use of part of Fort Gratiot Military Reservation for burial ground. The area was undeveloped, and only part of it was used by military forces. The government made a grant of 8 acres for cemetery purposes, and this grant was bounded by River Street, Elk Street, Kearny Street, and Lincoln Avenue. The bodies in the old cemetery just north of Minnie Street were removed to the new cemetery, and the old cemetery was sold June 6, 1853, to James Beard and Robert Hickling. All the land that you see here north of Glenwood Street was all a military reservation, even going further north than that. So there was a lot of land that belonged to the military. 12 years later, January of 1860, a petition signed by H.L. Stevens and 129 other citizens of Port Huron was presented to Congress asking that Port Huron be given additional land in the military reservation for the enlargement of the cemetery, parks, and other public purposes. The residents asked for all the land except that reserved for military purposes. Congress gave the city an additional 30 acres for cemetery purposes. The expansion here is represented by the blue line. So you can see it was a pretty large cemetery. Congress passed an act creating Pine Grove Park March 18, 1870, and gave the land to the city. In one corner of the park, a plot was reserved for burial of military personnel, and that plot would have been in the northeast corner of the park. The new Pinewood Cemetery, completed in 1871, was surrounded by dwellings. It had streets running through it. And we'll see in just a moment what the city wanted to do with that cemetery, and also what the people wanted to do with that cemetery. But prior to that, the decision was made once Pinewood was open, they would move all the bodies that was in the Pine Grove Park Military Cemetery over to Pinewood Cemetery or Woodlawn Cemetery. By 1873, Carlton Robinson, commissioner of the cemetery, reported to the council that there was no more ground fit for burial purposes in Pinewood Cemetery. A bill passed by Congress March 3, 1873, gave Port Huron the authority to dispose of the property. This was prime property for a city that was growing. The city wanted that for residential dwellings as well as business, and they wanted the cemetery to be further out where it wouldn't interfere with the growth of the city. So January 9, 1877, the city purchased 148 acres in Fort Gratiot Township for a little more than $5,300 from John Hoffman. Additional lots, which brought the total acreage to 176 acres, were also acquired. The new cemetery would be called Lakeside. So the city was now ready to move on with their plan of evacuating all the bodies from the Pinewood Cemetery, putting them into the new cemetery, and then using that space for residential and business. This photograph that you've been looking at is the oldest photograph that I've seen of Lakeside Cemetery. That's Holland going straight up there, and that was taken from the Asman Floor Shop, the roof, it looks like. You can see a little bit of the signage out in front. And of course, that's the Lakeside Cemetery to the right of Holland. Well, some of the residents weren't real happy with the city's plan to move all the bodies out of the Pinewood Cemetery and move them to Lakeside Cemetery. In this letter written to the city in 1885, some of the folks were giving their opinion on what they thought of moving the bodies to Lakeside. I'll let you read it, but I'll give you some of the highlights here. First of all, they said it was too expensive and be impractical to remove the bodies. Some of these people that were dead were traveling more than they did when they were alive. I mean, they went from the 4th Street Cemetery to the Military Street Cemetery. to the Pinewood Cemetery and now to the Lakeside Cemetery. Plus, they wanted to make it a much better cemetery. I mean, they had streets running through it, so they wanted to close the streets, just get rid of them. It says they wanted a vacation of the streets. 10th and Lincoln Avenue and Elk and Poplar and 11th and Kearney Streets, and even the alley. And then they said they wanted the cemetery to have a fence around it, and they wanted water to go into the cemetery, which they didn't have at that time. Well, obviously, the city didn't listen to them. This article appeared in the paper the same year, a few months later. The ordinances relative to the government of cemeteries passed its first, second, and third reading by its title. It was then read by sections and passed unanimously. The ordinance provides that no private burying ground will be tolerated within the city limits, that the city give notice to all lot owners in Pinewood Cemetery that bodies and headstones will be removed free of cost to Lakeside Cemetery within 90 days from date, that after such time, lots must be paid for and bodies must be removed at the expense of the lot owners. Well, it was a slow process removing the bodies from Pinewood Cemetery. This article was written in 1887, and it would seem that if the owners didn't give their permission, the bodies were removed anyway. Which is okay, that's what the city said they were going to do. However, the city should know where the bodies went, and they didn't. There were several articles in the newspaper during that period of time where people would look at Lakeside Cemetery and see if they could find their loved ones, and they couldn't. And the city didn't know where they were either, so it caused a lot of confusion and a lot of complaints. Well, I said it was a slow process, and it wasn't until 4 years later that they were finally able to put the lots up for auction. And as it says here, those lots sold like hotcakes. I'll go down here and let you read some of the prices that they paid for these lots and who bought them. And Lakeside wasn't the only cemetery where bodies were transferred to. They were also transferred to the Woodlands Cemetery. In this little blip here, it says, the work of removing bodies from Pinewood Cemetery to the new Woodland Cemetery is progressing rapidly. On Tuesday, 7 removals were made. That was in 1888. This cemetery was actually created in 1886. And here's one of the early pictures of it. And for those that don't know where this is off Lapeer, behind the fire station, just before you get to Herbert Drive. The Lakeside Cemetery wasn't without controversy as well. Controversy concerning Lakeside was about roads. Back then when the cemetery was built, Gratiot didn't go any further than Holland, and Gratiot would be the yellow line you see here. But there was also another road called the Lakeshore Road that ran close to the water, but it ran through a lot of swampy land when it came up to about the cemetery area, so it wasn't a very dependable road. The city sold off a northern part of their cemetery for a Catholic cemetery, and that would be Mount Hope. That was October 7th, 1875. They also put aside in the northeast corner of the cemetery a section for the Soldiers Cemetery. I believe it's now called the Allied Veterans Cemetery. This photo was taken in 1920 at the Soldiers Cemetery for a burial of one of the soldiers. All right, back to our street controversy. Stone Street didn't go all the way to Holland Avenue, but 10th Avenue did. And further, it went through the cemetery, and even north of that. It was the main road that folks in that area north of the cemetery used to get to the city. The city didn't want people north of the cemetery to be using 10th Avenue. This was now private property, and that was a private road now. They wanted to block it off and just use it for a cemetery road. Mount Hope Cemetery put their main entrance on 10th Avenue. And if they closed that off, they would have to change their entrance. The city's position was that they had a road that went there, the Lakeshore Road. Of course, like I said before, it just wasn't dependable. Fort Gratiot also didn't want people north of the cemetery to be using 10th Avenue because it bypassed their town. They wanted them to use the Lakeshore Road, at least to Holland, and then take Gratiot through their town. And that's basically what this article that was in the paper says. And if that's not confusing enough, there was another road that went through the cemetery, a private road that was built by Mr. McDonald to get to his farm. You remember old McDonald had a farm, don't you? Well, anyway, that's where it was. And the agreement, at least he thought it was, is that he would still be able to use that road, but they actually closed that road off to him. And that's what it says in this article here. This forced Mr. McDonald to go around by the way of the Lakeshore Road to drive into the north of the Catholic cemetery, across the swamp. In attempting this, he got his horses down and one of them injured, so as to lay him up several days. Another party from the city also tried it and got his horses down. Mr. McDonald appealed to the citizens of Fort Gratiot to help him, and they did. They turned out en masse. Not only did they open up the road, but they improved the road to make it better for the winter time. Superintendent of the cemetery, Mr. Patrick, faithful to his charge, soon put in an appearance in the most energetic manner, tried to stop the work. But the men were not easily frightened, and he left them with the comforting assurance that they would all be in jail within an hour, and it was the last they heard from him. Now by little more leveling, this road will be better than the other, and will accommodate our Catholic friends by leading direct to their main avenue gate and saving them at least 1/3 of a mile each way in going to their cemetery. A new chapel wasn't built at Lakeside Cemetery until almost 2 decades after the cemetery opened, at least not the chapel that we're familiar with. This article was dated 1896. The new chapel is now ready for occupancy, vaults fitted up in the latest improved manner. The chapel is a handsome building and one long needed. The chapel is 2 stories high and built on the side of a hill. The first story is of stone and the second story of wood. The building is of handsome design and has 2 towers built in substantial manner. The audience room is 23 by 23 feet and is located in the west part of the building. These photographs you're looking at now was taken by Michael Schroeder. They were taken just before the chapel was torn down. All right, let's continue. 2 broad flights of stairs lead to a chancel 10 by 23 feet in size. Off the chancel is a small room for the accommodation of clergymen. Both audience room and chancel are finished in natural pine. There are 10 square, 3 circle, and 2 half-circle stained glass windows of handsome design. A broad flight of stairs lead from the audience room to the vault below. The vault is fitted up with 12 catacombs, having all the latest improvements. Each catacomb has a stone bottom and the necessary rollers. The building was erected by fellow Truesdale at a cost of nearly $5,000. The chapel was there for over 3/4 of a century, and then this appeared in the paper, December of 1975. Lakeside Chapel to be torn down, and shortly after that it was. When Mr. Hoffman sold the land to the city for the cemetery, he thought he sold it all the way to the beach. And after the city built Lakeside Park, which extended from basically where Gratiot is now all the way to the Lakeshore Road, they decided they're going to include the beach in Lakeside Park. Whoa, just a minute, Mr. Hoffman said, and he sues the city. Notice to quit. Wesley Hoffman notifies city to vacate Lakeside Park front. A big lawsuit in sight. Wesley Hoffman claims to be the owner of a strip of land between Lakeside Park and Lake Huron. He claims it is part of an old fishery owned by Hoffman for years. The city officials have been investigating the matter and claim to have evidence that Mr. Hoffman's strip of land is located out in the lake, quite a distance, and I assume that Mr. Hoffman lost that lawsuit. Well, I'm sure some of your eyes have glazed over by now, but for those of you that are interested in history, the true history of the city, I think perhaps you may have learned something. I know I did. Join me in my next video, and I've got a very important announcement to make. So see you then.